Now, I want you all to think about the very first time that you have ever heard of the term slavery, and try to recall what you were told about the so-called slave ships amongst these slave stories. Many of you can recall hearing information given to you concerning the slave ships themselves, deriving from third-party sources, and maybe not your school initially. But that's very important to note, because we must now ask, where did these third-party sources retrieve their information about the slave ships in general? These third parties are things like books and movies and even the media that tends to give their cultivated possible descriptions of these so-called slave ships based merely on their perception of what they consider to be a fact, based on information taught by a stranger, or rather by someone else's opinion. For example, fictional movies like 12 Years a Slave and Armistead, then the resurfacing of the story surrounding Clotilda, which was allegedly found and deemed as the last American slave ship, just like the Wanderer, which was also deemed as the last American slave ship. But yet, there are no viable remains of either ship or boat, just a story, in order to keep the idealism of slavery afloat. What all of these third-party sources have in common is that their stories tends to lead to a dead end when researching any publicly verifiable evidence to validate their claims made, along with validating their depictions of what a slave ship actually is. So, what's a depiction? A depiction is an old French word that is defined as a portrayal in picture or a representation in words, a portrait. What is also very important to note here is that by creating a portrait or a portrayal of a depiction, it does not have to be accurate. It is just meant to show a generalized likeness or an idea of something by way of imagination that is agreed upon. According to an 18th century painter and the founder of the Society of Arts, Sir Joshua Reynolds stated that, quote, "In portraits, the grace, and we may add, the likeness consists more in the general air than in the exact similitude of every feature." So, what does all of this have to do with the existence of slave ships? Well, that's the point. There were no official slave ships, nor were there any ships created for the intended purpose to carry only slaves. These depictions that were mysteriously given to us about these ships manipulated the mind into believing that there were actual slave ships that existed, when in reality, there is no hard evidence to support this heavily campaigned theory. In fact, you will not find any colonial documentation that would use the term slave ship to describe their passenger ships, cargo ships, merchant vessels, or warships. This means that these stories of slave ships are contradicting themselves, because these ships were actually wooden sailboats that did not include utilitarian motors as a convenience. These motorless sailboats were originally known as rowboats that were called skiffs, dories, and wherries that were chiefly propelled by the use of sails and oars for navigating the boat even through tumultuous seas, violent winds, and unexpected climate changes. Between the 1500s and the 1800s, these rowboats were used for many things, like trading goods, or for the transportation of goods, exploration, pirateering, and of course, immigration. But just not those stories of immigration that most of you are accustomed to hearing about. And here's what I mean by that. Just imagine a school of people cramming themselves onto a boat today, trying drastically to avoid what's known as immigration laws, packing themselves in the trunks of vehicles, and even small cave-like holes underneath the ground, doing whatever it takes to travel to America due to their belief that America is the land of plenty with new beginnings for themselves and their families, opportunities for employment and affordable housing, all while risking their lives in hopes of gaining freedom. This should all ring a bell here and make you wonder if people were willing or unwilling to aboard these rowboats or cargo passenger ships in the first place. Or maybe the question should be, were people forced into slavery, or was slavery simply done by choice? Now, before I go any further, I want you to note again that during the 1600s and until the near end of the 1800s, rowboats or cargo ships were not modernized to include engines or motors that would conveniently drive the boat throughout the seas. The commercial production of steamboats or riverboats were made available at the tail end of the 1800s as well, which should make you wonder, how many so-called slave ships were accounted for that enabled strangers to carry a whopping 12.5 million people, along with supplies, food, and other cargo from one continent to another? And if there were no motors or engines attached to these slave ships, then some company or fictionalized character would have been created and placed up for public display by now in order to showcase how an impossible task of dragging millions of people out of their native lands and forcing them to work on some distant land is somehow a reality, and it actually happened. But I guess since slavery was so bad that it's no need to prove that these slave ships actually existed, right?